Hello everyone, welcome back to Amy's Bookshelf. Today is my May reading wrap up and I read a lot of books in May. So this is 11 of them, then I've got 4 more on audio that I will go through. So yeah, May was a really big reading month. Weirdly, last May I remember I read like 18 books, so I don't know what it is about May, although it might be that we have a lot of bank holidays and we had an extra one this year as well, so that just gives me more reading time. Plus it's like a longer month because it's 31 days instead of 30, so maybe it's just a mix of everything. But anyway, I always seem to read a lot in May. So yeah, 15 books, so quite a lot of variety. Unfortunately, again, keeping on theme for me, not too many 5-star reads, which is a shame, but I will go into them and I'll tell you their ratings and a bit about what I thought of them. So let's get into it. Okay, first up is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. Now I found this in a charity shop because Toni Morrison is obviously a very famous author, and I remember I think there were a couple of modules that included her books at uni when I went to uni, but I never was in those modules, so I never ended up reading any, but I'd always heard really good things, especially about The Bluest Eye and also about Beloved. So yeah, those were 2 books I really wanted to read, and I found this in a charity shop for like £1 and it was perfect and it's a nice cover, so was happy to pick it up. Now I think firstly I want to caveat by saying that I knew reading Toni Morrison would feel for me a little bit sort of dated, and I don't mean that as like an offence or like any kind of criticism, but what I mean is that the nature of the writing I think was going to be a little harder to get through because it's not like a modern contemporary, and that's like partly on me because I don't read a lot of books that were published sort of pre-2000, and also because I know what I enjoy, and sometimes like really dense writing I just find really hard to get through. So I knew going in that it was going to be a little bit difficult, and it was, and it felt a little bit sort of dated, but again I don't mean dated as a criticism, just kind of as a fact of when it was written. I believe this was published in the 70s, so obviously like 50 years ago now, and yeah, going in I didn't really know much about it. I didn't really know what to expect. I knew that it was going to be quite upsetting and hard to read in places, and that is definitely true. I would really recommend you looking at the trigger warnings before going into reading it, but I did end up really enjoying it. It was definitely a bit dense in places. I think it was one of those books that I just kind of kept going and hoping that it would all come together, and it did. Now one thing I really liked about the book, and this is a personal preference, is that it was narrated by a child, and I do kind of really enjoy books that aren't children's books that are narrated by children, and the reason I make that differentiation is because children's books that are narrated by children often don't delve into a lot of big topics in very detailed ways, obviously because the subject matter would be too hard for children, and children's books are written in a way that children can digest. But adult books from the perspective of children I think is a whole different ball game, and it was equally fascinating as it was just really heartbreaking. There's something about the innocence of a child and reading a narrative from their perspective, knowing that there are parts of the story that they aren't understanding or that they just don't have the capacity to fully be able to acknowledge because they're so young. One comparison I made to The Bluest Eye when I talked about it on Instagram was Betty by Tiffany McDaniel. This was one of my favourite reads of last year. Again, really upsetting, really hard to read in places, but I loved that it was narrated by a child because I think you just gain a whole new perspective. And yes, it was heartbreaking, yes it was really horrible to read in places, but it was also really beautiful because you get the perspective of this little human. So I did really like it for that. But going back to The Bluest Eye, like I said, really hard to read in places, but I can completely understand why Toni Morrison is held in such a high place as she is, because yeah, really well written, really beautifully done, and I definitely will be reading more Toni Morrison in the future, and I gave this 4 stars. Next up is my first audiobook of the month, and that was Orgy by Caitlin Greenidge. Really annoyingly, this is not Goodreads, because for some reason Goodreads refused to put audiobooks or like short stories that are only available on specific platforms on Goodreads. Ugh, honestly, like the fact that Goodreads is owned by Amazon is just disgusting, because like they have Amazon only books on there, obviously, but they won't do it for anything else. So audio is only available on Scribd as an audiobook because it's like a Scribd original, and there are some Scribd originals on Goodreads, but for some reason some of the others aren't on there, and so it's very, very annoying. But anyway, this was a short story, so it's a very quick read. I think it's under an hour, and that's if you listen to it at one speed. So if you listen to it faster than that, it's a very, very quick read. The first book I've read by Caitlin Greenidge, and it is a short story, like I said, set in New York during the COVID pandemic, like right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, so when things are really, really pandemic-y, and the protagonist makes the decision to go to a sex party even though COVID is full on in swing and people shouldn't be mixing. So it was a really interesting story. I thought it was really well written. Obviously, because it's a short story, it wasn't very long, so it didn't go into some of the areas of the book that I probably would have liked it to if it had been a full-length novel. But yeah, it was really interesting, just about identity, about autonomy, about freedom, about making our own decisions while there's a global pandemic on. So yeah, I did really enjoy it, and I definitely would read more from Caitlin Greenidge, and I gave that 3.5 stars. Next up is another audiobook that I read the same evening because that one was so short and I was doing a puzzle and I wanted some more audiobooks. So this was The Book That No One Wanted to Read by Richard Ayoade. This is a children's middle grade book, and if you don't know, Richard Ayoade is a British comedian. I love him already. So I saw this on Libby, my library app, and I downloaded it because I really like him and I find him funny, and I thought it would be a nice book to read. So the book is about a child who plucks up a friendship with a book on a bookshelf, and it's a book that no one wants to read, and it's basically their conversation about the nature of reading, about books, about why no one wants to read this book, and the child sort of learning and understanding from the perspective of this book. It was really funny, but obviously it is a children's book, so not completely the humour that I think Richard Ayoade would normally use, but like quite deadpan in places while also being quite nuanced. So yeah, it was just a fun hour-long listen. Again, a really short book, so if you've got the time, I would recommend it. And I gave that one 3.5 stars also. Next, I read Glory by Novila Bulawayo, and this, if you want to know more details about my reading experience, then I recommend you go watch my reading blog. So on the first May bank holiday weekend, I did a vlog of all of the books I read over the bank holiday, and this was one of them. Now, if you don't know, this was shortlisted for, I believe, the Women's Prize for Fiction, either this year or last year, very recently. And I'd seen it about Instagram because obviously a lot of people talk about prize-winning books and the books that are shortlisted and longlisted and, you know, make their way through reading them. And I'm always a bit scared of prize-winning books because often I just can't understand them. I'm not the kind of reader that likes working very hard for books. So yeah, I was apprehensive going in. Now, I initially started this in physical form, and it quickly became apparent that I just was not going to be able to get through the whole thing physically. So I switched to audio because it was on, I think, my Libby app or maybe on Scribd. But anyway, I had it as an audiobook, so I switched to that. That definitely helped. If you are struggling with Glory, or with any books actually, I would really recommend switching to audio because it does take away some of the difficulty of being able to get through a book, because obviously you're listening and someone's sort of doing that work for you, and yeah, it made it much easier for me. Now, like I said, go watch the vlog if you want more details, but overall, I didn't love it. I think ultimately that was because a lot of the themes just went over my head. And while I could appreciate what the author was trying to do and what the story was trying to tell, I just wasn't the right audience for it, I don't think. I didn't really want to sit there and dissect all of the narrative and really like understand all of the nuance of the plot. So yeah, it just wasn't something that I could really fully get into and love. The premise vaguely is a fictional country in Africa that is inhabited by animals. Although in the world, I think, of Glory, animals, it's an anthropomorphization of animals, so animals acting like humans, and that is the whole world, that everyone is an animal. I've explained that really badly, I'm so sorry. Think Animal Farm, although the book really isn't anything like Animal Farm, but it's the same in that there's talking animals, yeah, that have been anthropomorphized. So yeah, there was a lot of interesting things like that, and there were tiny moments I really did enjoy, like the fact that they referred to this like baboon president in America. There was obviously some kind of parallel to Donald Trump. I did really enjoy the really little moments like that. But overall, like I said, I really couldn't appreciate the thing in its totality because it just went over my head. It was a little bit too dense. It was a very long book as well. There was a lot of repetition, which I really didn't enjoy, especially on audio, because I just had to listen to that over and over again, which yeah, wasn't my cup of tea. But yeah, overall, I enjoyed the fact that I read it, and I like the fact that I have read it, so I have an opinion on it. But yeah, it's not going to be one I really recommend to anyone, and I give it 2.5 stars. Next is another very short read, Marigold and Rose by Louise Gluck. This says it was the winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, so another prize-winning book, but this one for me I did enjoy. So like I said, it is really short, like super short, because not only has it got only like 52 pages, but it's also sort of written in verse, so it does go very quickly. So this is definitely one you can read in one sitting. Now, I am a twin, if you didn't know, non-identical, and this book also has twins as the forefront of the story, and they are also non-identical twins. And to be honest, for me, my main takeaway was the exploration of twins and their identity, and how they can be very different as people, despite the fact that a lot of people kind of put twins into this box of being the same thing. I can remember being a child, and actually still now people do refer to me and my sister as the twins. Like, that is the kind of label that we have on us. And don't get me wrong, I didn't like take it personally. I'm not like scarred by that or anything, but it is really interesting how a lot of people do just put twins together in the same box as if they are one person. So I did really enjoy the exploration of that. Because it's written in verse and it's a very short book, it doesn't go into things in massive detail, but for a book that takes, you know, an hour to read in one sitting, I could really appreciate it, and overall I gave it 4 stars. Okay, and up next is The Pact We Made, and this is the first and potentially the only, if I remember correctly, 5-star read of the month. So this is by Layla Alamar, and it is set in Kuwait, and the protagonist Delilah is about to turn 30 and her parents are desperate for her to get married. Hello, Editing Amy here. I just wanted to say that the protagonist in The Pact We Made isn't called Delilah, it is Dahlia. I have just finished reading Delilah Green Doesn't Care, and I think that's why I kept saying Delilah, but it's not Delilah, it's Dahlia, just so you know. Her mum is finding suitors and bringing them to the house, and Delilah is essentially rejecting all of them because she doesn't want to marry them. She isn't interested in getting married necessarily, or not to the people that are coming to the door anyway. And honestly, I just adored this book. I thought it was beautifully written but explored so many interesting themes. So obviously Delilah's own identity and her autonomy. She lives with her parents and also living in a country like Kuwait as well, and what that means to be a woman and the expectations of how she's going to live her life. That was all really fascinating. And then also I loved the relationship she had with her friends, and just how it explored little elements of that, about how they find freedom within each other, about the secrets that they share, about like their relationship with each other. There were just so many interesting parts of the book, and like I said, beautifully written as well. It does get pretty heavy quite late on, so I would recommend looking at the trigger warnings, but honestly I adored it, and considering it's a debut, I think this is really impressive. So I will definitely be reading anything that Layla Alamar brings out. And I also said in my Instagram, this has so few ratings on Goodreads, it's got like 400. So if you're looking for like a really underhyped book that you've not seen anyone else talk about apart from me on this video, then yeah, I would recommend picking it up and getting yourself a copy. Also good to be reading books that aren't set in the UK or US. Never read a book set in Kuwait before, so that was really interesting, and yeah, just really loved it. Then we have The Bees by Layleen Poole. This was just a whirlwind, a roller coaster of a book. Going in, and when I also put it in my TBR basket, because I put the genres of books above my books in my TBR basket, I described this as dystopia. Having read the blurb and having seen very small snippets of reviews and just like a vague sense of what it was, I thought it was dystopia. It's described on the back, Flora 717 is a survivor. Born in the lowest class of the totalitarian hive society, she is prepared to sacrifice everything for the queen, surviving internal massacres, religious purges, blah 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 blah. I was like, sounds like a dystopia, right? It's called The Bees. Never did it occur to me that it was literal bees. And I don't know why, because I think it should have done. I think it's probably quite obvious. But I just think the idea of a book from the perspective of bees is wild. So I think that's why it never occurred to me. Now, I also ended up listening to a lot of this on audio, again, because it's very difficult. Well, it's a very difficult concept to grasp, and I think trying to get through that physically would have taken a lot of like a mental toll on me. So listening to it in audio, at least at the beginning, is a much better way to just get yourself into the book, understand the premise, and then you can really get going with it. Now, having read it, I thought actually it was really good. It explores a lot of themes, and obviously because it's set in a beehive, I think you just have to suspend your disbelief. Just forget they're bees. Don't think about it too much. Don't overthink it, because if you do, I think you will start to pick holes in it, because it's very hard for us as human beings to like imagine that much detail from such tiny creatures in this beehive. So just disregard that. Just don't worry about the fact they're bees. Don't dwell on it. Just try and enjoy it. And I think if you just let yourself enjoy it, don't overthink it, it is a really enjoyable book. Like I said, loads of really interesting things about like freedom, about being part of a hive while trying to have your own identity, about the rules and regulations of this bee society. And yeah, it wasn't my favourite book ever. I'm not sure I would ever reread it, but it was so different, so I really loved it for that. And overall, I think I gave it 3.5, if not 4 stars. So yeah, would recommend if you're looking for something just really, really different. Then I read Three Daughters of Eve by Elif Shafak. Now, I really love Elif Shafak. I've read 10 minutes and 38 seconds in This Strange World, and I've also read The Islands of Missing Trees, and they are both books I adored. So I saw this in a charity shop, I think, and picked it up because, yeah, just wanted to read all of her books. So as a lot of her books are, this is set in 2 places, Oxford and Istanbul, and it also straddles time periods as well of about 30 years. So it doesn't go too far back in history, but it focuses on the history of our protagonist, whose name is Perry. And yeah, so it focuses on her days at university and what happened while she was there, and then also the present day of her life as a housewife. So first off, I want to say I didn't enjoy this as much as I've enjoyed Shafak's other books. That's not to say I didn't enjoy it at all, it just wasn't like a 5-star read for me, whereas 10 minutes and 38 seconds and I think potentially The Island of Missing Trees, I both rated 5 stars as well. But having said that, yeah, really, I still really enjoyed it. So I loved that it went into detail about the protagonist's identity and how she was struggling with that, both when she was a student at university and also when she is an adult and a housewife and with her family. It's also really interesting how religion played a part in this book. Religion is a really big part of this book, and especially faith as well, and it's something that Perry contemplates a lot throughout, especially in relation to her parents, who both have a very different relationship with religion and faith, and she kind of wanted to find her place, and I think she wanted to sort of put herself in either box. Was she going to be like her mum or was she going to be like her dad? But sort of slowly realises that she can actually be her own thing and have her own identity with faith as well. So I really loved that exploration. Overall, I think the ending was a little bit rushed, and that's potentially why I didn't give it 5 stars. I think there were moments at the end, I won't go into detail because it's spoilers, but things happen, and I think they could have been given a little bit longer time to have been served a little bit more justice. But overall, like I said, did really enjoy it. The same beautiful writing that I expect from Shafak, because I have read 3 of her books now, and would still recommend it, and I gave it 4 stars. Then we have Small Pleasures by Claire Chambers. This was my book club read for the month. If you want to join my book club, the link is in the description. Now, going into this, I had heard that the ending was insane. That was basically all I knew about this book, so I was expecting a lot from it, and I read it very quickly. I read it in one day because, to be honest, I just really wanted to get to the end and to see what happened. The premise of it is it's set in the 50s in England, and this woman comes forward to a newspaper and says that her daughter was the product of a virgin birth, so she became pregnant without having sex and then had a daughter. Her daughter, I think, is about 11 in this book, 10 or 11. So it is about the reporter that she goes to trying to work out whether this virgin birth is actually true and whether it did happen. So there's sort of a bit of a science element to it, because they are trying in the 50s, so bearing in mind technology isn't as advanced as it is now and they can't do the same kind of tests, but trying to understand whether it is a virgin birth while also exploring this woman's history, and also the reporter's relationship with the woman and her family, so her daughter and her husband. There's quite a lot of elements to it, to be honest, and having discussed it with my book club, it became quite obvious that no one loved this book, and I can completely understand why. It had so many good elements, but it was so much trying to smush itself into one book. It was too much. For me in particular, again, it's kind of hard to say these things without spoiling it, but there were 2 main elements to this book, and I think if they'd each been a book in themselves, it would have been a far better book to read, but trying to smush them together into one book was too much. It meant that nothing really was explored properly. It didn't have as much time as I would have liked it to. And yeah, overall, I think it wasn't done enough justice. Then we come to the ending, which I can't tell you because it will spoil it. Why? It was completely completely unnecessary. If you cut the first page and the last chapter of this book, it would have been better and it would have been the same book. Obviously I can't tell you any more than that, but if you do read it, or if you have read it, then let me know, because you will know exactly what I mean when you read it. But yeah, enough of that said. Other elements of it that I know my book club didn't enjoy was the fact it was set in the 50s and all of the female characters in this book were a little bit problematic, whether that was in their relationship with the men or just in their own identity, and not really being very three-dimensional characters. Again, I think that it fell victim to the fact that there was just too much going on in this book, and if some of the elements had been taken away, then these women could have had more space to actually find their identity and become more three-dimensional. So yeah, I think it's safe to say I didn't love it. Probably 2.5/3 stars. It's not convinced me to read much more by Claire Chambers, because I'm not sure I really trust her ability to put together a plot. But maybe that's a bit harsh, because the writing was okay. So if another one of her plots tickles my fancy, then I might pick up a book. Next up is a very short book. It is Whites by Ortega Uwagba, and this is literally 70 pages. Oh no, less than 70. 66 pages. Very, very short, and obviously a very small book as well, so they're like 66 half pages. So like Marigold and Rose, you can sit down and read this in an hour easily. Now, this is an essay that was written in the aftermath of George Floyd's death in 2020. I believe the author, there's a little bio here, says she's the author of Sunday Times bestseller Little Black Book, A Toolkit for Working Women. Her writing has been published in The Guardian, The Cut, ID and Dazed, among other publications, and she was selected, blah, blah, blah. So I think she's just a sort of an educator and a writer, and yeah. So she explains at the beginning of the essay that this is something that she never wanted to read. She didn't want to write an essay about race that centred white people. But after what happened to George Floyd, she kind of felt compelled to write it. Obviously, there's a lot of literature, a lot of conversations, a lot going on in the aftermath of George Floyd, and since then, actually, because obviously that was in 2020, so we're 3 years on from that now, which feels like a long time ago. But yeah, this is a really interesting book, obviously to read from the perspective of a white person, but also what I thought was most interesting about it was how it explores the fact that our generation and a lot of people in this day and age are perpetually online. It talks a little bit about performatism, social media performatism, and people's reaction to what happened, and ever since then as well. I think it's one of those essays where, because it's so short, there's no reason not to read it. It explores, like I said, a lot of interesting topics that I think then can catapult you into other areas that you can then read more, because it definitely whets your appetite for that kind of thing. So yeah, would really recommend it. I think I gave it 4 stars. Next is Panenka by Ronan Hessian. Now, I'd seen this on social media and I was intrigued. The cover is stunning for a start, but also I just thought it sounded like an interesting plot. I'm really compelled to books about the human connection, and books that are sort of character driven, where they don't necessarily have much plot, but we just explore people's relationships with each other and also explore themselves as well and their own identity. So this one is about a man called Panenka. That's not his real name, that is a nickname. And it is about his tumultuous relationship with his daughter and her son, and also just about his own identity, what happened in his past, how he got the nickname Panenka, which, by the way, I didn't know is the name of like a thing that you do in football when you take a penalty. If you read it, it will become clear. But he used to be a professional footballer, which is how he got that nickname. And yeah, so when I started reading it, I wasn't really convinced. They were talking a lot about football, which I don't love, so I think it took me a while to get into the book, but by the end I really loved it. There's a part of the book, again I can't spoil it, but there's an element of the book that I think really brings it together and kind of gives it finality and gives it a bit more purpose as a book. So I really enjoyed that. I liked watching Panenka's build his relationship with his grandson, and also this new woman that comes into his life. We see how they get on, and there were moments and pieces of writing that I thought were really profound and beautiful. So yeah, really love that. I also have, by Ronan Hessian, I don't think you can see it, it's up there, no, Leonard and Hungry Paul, which was recommended to me by one of my book club members, and I'm really looking forward to that because I've heard it's just really wholesome and like a hug in a book, and I think having read this I can completely believe that, because that's exactly how this felt. So very much looking forward to that, and I gave Panenka 4 stars. Okay, and next is my final audio read of the month, which was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. I have read Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo and really loved it. It was a few years ago and I remember being apprehensive because it was written in verse, and I don't read many books written in verse, but I'd heard such good things, so I gave it a chance and I really loved it. If you are scared of reading books written in verse, completely understandable, but Elizabeth Acevedo is such a great writer to introduce you to that kind of writing. She does it in a way that's very digestible. It's accessible for people who aren't used to reading books like that. So yeah, Clap When You Land is brilliant, and arguably I think The Poet X is actually better. So The Poet X is a like YA that follows Zumara, who is our protagonist, and she I think is 15, about to be 16, so again young adult, and it is about her life essentially. It is about her exploring her identity, her relationship with her mother, and her relationship with religion as well. Her mother is very, very devout and she wants Zumara to be like that as well, but Zumara is rebelling and she doesn't want to be like that. So it is about that element of her life. It's also about her sort of working out her sexuality, about her relationship with boys and how she wants to explore that. It's also about her relationship with her friends and just to sort of finding out where she fits into the world. She has a huge passion for writing, for poetry, and she wants to be able to showcase that more. So she builds a good relationship with her new English teacher, and it is about her being able to explore that element of her life and her passion and be able to become the Poet X. So yeah, like I said, I actually think I enjoyed this more than Clap When You Land. The writing was stunning. Like, writing in verse is always a little bit scary for me because I just sometimes think, am I going to understand it? But you don't need much time with Acevedo's writing to be convinced that it's fine. It's once you're into it and you kind of understand the flow and the rhythm, it's just like prose. You don't need to be scared of it. There's nothing to worry about. I completely understood all of the plot. But yeah, because it's written in verse, you just get these really like beautiful tidbits and like little snippets that just has so much like rhythm and musicality to it that you don't necessarily get in prose writing. So yeah, loved it for that and just think it's a really great book. So would highly, highly recommend. And I think given how passionate I have been about talking to this, I probably should give it 5 stars. So this can be my second 5-star read of the month. Okay, final 3 books. So first we have 50/50 by Steve Kavanagh. I've read quite a few Steve Kavanagh books. So if you don't know, he writes courtroom thrillers, and this series is the Eddie Flynn series. I think there's 6 now, and they don't have to be read in order. So I have read number 1, which is The Defence. I've read 13, which I think is number 4. I've read 50/50, which is number 5. And is that it? I think that might be it. So I haven't read all of them. I've read about half of them. But yeah, I've really enjoyed all the Steve Kavanagh books I've read so far. They're very clever, they're very layered, and they normally leave you quite satisfied in terms of a thriller. So 50/50 is about 2 sisters who at roughly the same time at night call the police to tell them that the other one, so the other sister that isn't them, has killed their father. They're both at their father's house. His dead body is in his bedroom and both sisters are relatively near him. So they both call the police on each other saying that the other one did it. So essentially the mystery of the plot is trying to work out which one of them did it, and I think that alone is a really good hook. It's easy to see why you can be really gripped on this book because you just want to know who did it, and yeah, Kavanagh is a brilliant writer. He keeps you really hooked throughout, even when you think you know who it is or you think you've worked it out, he kind of throws in another twist, and it just really keeps it fast paced and on the edge of your seat. So I really can't fault him, to be honest. I didn't give this 5 stars just because I've read a lot of thrillers and I think it's hard for them not to be a little bit predictable, and that's not Steve Kavanagh's fault. It is hard when it is this kind of format to keep something from being able to be worked out. So it wasn't unsatisfying by all means. It was still really satisfying ending. I really loved all the twists. I really loved the storyline, but it just wasn't a 5-star read for me, so I give it 4 stars. Penultimate read of the month was Human Acts by Han Kang. This is translated from Korean and it is set in South Korea. So I didn't really know much about this. Again, I got it from a charity shop and I'm always about reading translated books. So when I saw it, I picked it up because I've heard a lot of good things about The Vegetarian, which is another one of her books. I've not wanted to pick up The Vegetarian because I've heard it's a little bit horror-esque and I just really don't do horror. So that's why I haven't picked that up, but I knew that this one wasn't really that genre, so I wanted to give it a go. Now, The plot of it is very hard for me to actually tell you because, to be honest, there's not actually that much plot at all. The main crux of it that you need to understand is there is an uprising in South Korea and this boy is killed, and it's essentially everything that happens in the aftermath of that. We hear from various characters and various perspectives, and it's sort of everything that unfolds. Now for me, I just found this book very disappointing, and I really hate saying that because I really wanted to love it. The blurb sounded like this like really beautiful exploration of like human emotion and the human condition and how we kind of destroy each other, and the beauty and the horror in that. But there were two elements of this that I just couldn't get on board with. Firstly was just how unnecessarily graphic it was, and I think I should have seen that coming, knowing what the vegetarian is and how graphic the vegetarian is, and obviously that's just a style that the author enjoys. So I should have expected that, but for me, it wasn't necessary. I didn't need to hear all of that like gory detail. And then the second thing was just, it was a really, really fragmented plot. And that's why I can't really give you like a good synopsis, because I'm not really sure I grasped it myself. Like I said, we jump around from character to character. We jump a little bit in time as well. So every new chapter just felt like a whole new story, really. And I didn't really kind of connect everything together properly. It didn't feel cohesive and like one piece. So I just didn't love it. And I feel bad saying that because I really wanted to love it. But yeah, it just wasn't for me, and I won't be picking up The Vegetarian either as a result. I think if I really loved this, I could have been convinced to pick up The Vegetarian because a lot of people love it, but yeah, it's not convinced me. So it's like a 2.5/3-star read. And the final read of the month is This Is How It Always Is by Laurie Frankel. Now, the plot of this book is about two parents they have 5 children, and their youngest child, at about 4 or 5 years old, comes out as trans, expresses to them that they think they might be trans. Now, I will be using she, her pronouns for Poppy, who is the trans character in this book, but her pronouns do change throughout depending on what point in time we are and how old she is, but I'll be using she, her. And yeah, so Poppy is the main character of this book, but I do think the perspective, it's important to kind of note that the perspective of it really is from her parents. And yeah, so there are 2 things I think I want to say about this book. Firstly, that I think it would have been a better book if it had been from the perspective of Poppy instead. I've read a fair few middle grade books, and I've read middle grade books that explore like sexuality and identity, and they have always been really good reads for me. I've always really enjoyed them, and I think it's because when it's from the perspective of the person going through it, it kind of feels a bit like messy and unsure, and like they don't really know how they are feeling, or they maybe struggle to express it. And I think there's kind of like a beauty and a relatability in that as well. Obviously that's not true of all books, but in some of the books I have read that is true. And I think I would have enjoyed that more, just hearing more from Poppy of how she was feeling, of what she was going through, and just her being able to express a little bit more about how she felt she fit into the world, I suppose. So, but yeah, like I said, the book is mainly from her parents' perspective. I do think, having read the Goodreads reviews and having read a little bit more about the author, I think the reason that is because the author was sort of telling her own story. I believe she has a trans child, and so I think this was kind of the book she felt she needed to write, because it's fictional, but I think it was very much based on a lot of feelings and emotions and her own story. So that absolutely makes sense, and I don't want to criticise that. I don't want to take that away from her. If it was a very like cathartic thing for her to do, obviously, then do that. You write that book, and this is a very popular book, so you know, can't deny that. But yeah, the second part of the book that I just wanted to dwell on was the fact that it was a really heartwarming story. It reminded me a lot of Wonder, if you have read that or if you have seen the movie, because that was very popular as well. And the reason it reminded me of that, so Wonder is from the perspective of the main character, and so it is sort of like a middle grade book. But it had the same feeling as that. It had the same like heartwarming moments, compelling moments, like really joyous moments, and so I really did enjoy it for that. But I think overall, I just felt like it was a very long book, and it sort of tried to shoehorn in a lot of situations and circumstances so that the characters could express certain emotions or express certain opinions. And for me, it just felt a little bit too like cookie cutter. So I didn't love it for that. It didn't 100% feel like natural and realistic for that. I think it was a really interesting exploration of what the parents were going through, of what the child Poppy was going through as well. And I believe that it's going to be a book that will be relatable for a lot of people. I think the fact that it wasn't perfect is maybe a testament to the fact that these stories are all different and nuanced, and nobody's ever going to be able to be fit into like a cookie cutter hole, because that's just not how the world works. So yeah, I don't want to criticise it too much, but I think it could have been better for me if the perspective would have changed, and yeah, it just explored things in a different way. So I give this 3.5, maybe edging to a 4, but I'll keep it at a 3.5 for now. Okay, so that was a very long wrap up. I'm very sorry. I'll try and cut this down a little bit, but yeah, I just read a lot of books this month. But like I said, not been loving the fact that I haven't found a lot of 5-star reads this year. I've got a couple in this list, which is great, but I'm still determined to add more this year because I just haven't been finding them, which is a shame. But overall, a very good reading month. I read a wide variety of books, and I'm looking forward to what I'm reading in June. Hope you've enjoyed this. Please like my video and please subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed it. I'll obviously be doing another wrap up in June, and before then I'll have 2 or 3 new videos out about other bookish things, so look out for those. Yeah, hope you've enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Bye.